And I give you greetings today and introduce myself as Bear. English, Jim Bear Jacobs, serves just fine. Also introduce myself as a member of the Turtle Clan of the Mohican Nation. And with greetings in my heart, I extend, or with goodness in my heart, I extend my greetings to you today. So, John started this evening out with thoughts on perspective, and then kind of followed it up with some words about intentional diversity, and it's a wonderful thing. That's an admirable goal. However, as an American Indian, sometimes when I hear about this intentional diversity, I get suspicious. Because even in groups that are being intentionally diverse, Native Americans are often overlooked. And it's a reality of numbers. We're about as minorities can get in our own home country. We make up less than 1% of the population. That's systematic genocide at its finest, right? It was successful, but it was not complete. We are still here. But at less than 1% of the population, that means, if you're a politician, you can overlook the Native Americans and you will not get a political backlash. Okay? If you're a social worker, you don't need to pay all that much attention to the needs of Native Americans. If you're a philanthropic organization, your funds would be better served in African American communities or Hispanic communities, where you're going to see more of a return on your investment than you will with Native American communities. And that's just the reality of the situation. And so, growing up, when I would hear words like reconciliation, I would always get incredibly suspicious about what was going on. Because number one, reconciliation is a word that is completely meaningless without action. And we don't even realize what we're saying, right? When we speak of reconciliation, reconciliation means that there was a point in history where things were good that we hope to go back to. Okay? That there were a good old days. Okay? You ever notice when you hear the term good old days, who's saying it? Typically it's white people speaking to the good old days. You rarely hear African Americans, Native Americans, or other people of color talk about the good old days. Because we just don't have that in our narrative. Okay? So reconciliation isn't even the right word to use. There isn't a point of conciliation where we can go back to. So we need to speak of in different terms. So I use words like healing, because healing is a moving forward. And I started this group in 2011 called Healing Minnesota Stories. The premise is that the stories of Minnesota are incomplete, they're anemic, they're one-sided, and that in order for those stories to become full and complete, they need to be healed. And they can only be healed by bringing in the perspective from the margins. So, myself being Native American, that's where my focus is bringing the Native American perspective and voice into the areas where it's long been absent. And because I'm a person of faith and a pastor, my main focus is on churches, faith communities, Bible college, University-Seminaries around the state of Minnesota. Okay. But that was a tough road for me to go from a Christian who happened to be Native American, to being a Native American Christian. And you may not think that that's a big difference there, but it is an incredible difference. I grew up in a very conservative evangelical home, in a very conservative evangelical denomination that goes back for 4 generations on both sides of my family. Okay? And because of divorce, as John said, my father is Mohican, my mother is not. I was raised by my mother. I only had a very limited exposure to my native Mohican side of my family. So just like Christmas and Easter, but not enough to really cement an understanding. And when I became old enough to drive, bought a car, and I started taking trips back to the reservation. Our reservation's in the middle of Wisconsin. So I would drive to 6 hours, and I spent the whole summer with my grandma and my aunties and uncles out there, and we would travel all around Wisconsin, did just the stuff you do when you spend the summer with your grandmother. But I began to realize that out there on the reservation, kind of the way that I thought fit in with these people, whereas the way that I thought didn't necessarily fit in growing up in predominantly white schools. I knew that there was just something inherently different that fit in with my native brothers and sisters, my native relatives, fit in with my white relatives. But when I came back after that summer, and I started telling my pastor about all these cultural experiences and kind of insights that I was gaining, my pastor looks at me and he said, "Jim Bear, that's really nice and all. But remember, you're a Christian first." Well, that spoke. There's subtext there, right? There's a subtext there that says Christianity and being native, cannot mix. It's because of that subtext that's born out of fear and unwillingness to relate and understand the other. Natives are one of the most demonized people groups in the world. There are churches all over this country where if I were to bring a drum into the church, I would immediately be excused from the church. A drum. Okay. Now, if I brought a tambourine into the same church, I'd be welcome. But a drum. Okay. I have eagle feathers that have been given to me throughout the years to honor me in that. I use them as a way of connecting with the Creator. I use them in prayer. And there are churches where if I brought those into the sanctuary, I would be removed from the sanctuary. But if I brought a dove into the sanctuary, hey, welcome with open arms, right? And these are just, these are incredibly insignificant differences, but because of those centuries of demonization, that still lingers today. There's suspicion. I'm met with suspicion, with mystery, and just those words. Remember, Jim Bear, you were a Christian first. Talk about an identity crisis. Okay? Because here I was, this 16-year-old kid who loved Jesus with all his heart, but yet could not make this connection into kind of a full spiritual understanding of who I was. I had no rootedness into what my spiritual identity was. So I got that incredible love for Jesus on one hand, and on the other hand, this understanding that when I sit under the teaching of some of my native elders, I'm tapping into something that goes back for me, goes back centuries and centuries and centuries to the very dawn of existence in this country. And it creates this identity crisis in myself. And I carried that identity crisis all the way through high school, all the way through Bible college. And it wasn't until I reached seminary, and I went to seminary at Bethel Seminary here in St. Paul. And Bethel is one at the time. Bethel was an institution that was focused on being intentionally diverse. Okay, so they track their diversity. And one of the things that they do to track this diversity is they take basically a student census of people of color in their student body. Okay, and this, I don't know if it comes out every year or every other year, but it comes out. Most institutions in higher learning do this. But you get the racial breakup of the student body. And so, it says, at the seminary, African Americans, 17. Hispanic Americans, Asian Pacific Islanders, all of these. And it said Native Americans, 0. And a friend of mine brought this to my attention. She said, Jimmer, they don't even count you. And so that's when I realized something that I took a look around me. I was the only Native American in the seminary. And I started asking my professors, have you ever had a Native American in one of your classes before? Oh, sure. I said, okay, well, what was their name? Oh, well, I don't know. But I'm sure I had to have had a Native American in my class. I mean, they were making this assumption just on the pure numbers of years that they were teaching, that they had to have a Native American in their class. But not one professor I asked could name the Native American that was in their class, which told me a very important thing. Now, I don't believe that I was the only Native American ever to go through Bethel. In fact, I know I wasn't. But I do know that in the minds of those professors, not one Native American ever had an impact on that seminary. So I decided that was going to change. Okay? And in every class I had, with every professor I had, I would find a way to introduce a Native perspective. When we're talking about ethics, hey, Professor, in the Native way, this is how we view this. In theology, Professor, you're kind of limited with your white European vision here. Let me introduce you to some Native perspective. Okay? In every class I had. I was even to the point where I was wondering myself. I was beginning to annoy myself because I was feeling like I'm being a little bit obnoxious here. But I wanted to make sure that this seminary would never be able to again say we don't know of a Native American student who came through our ranks. And on the day I graduated, one of my professors, whom I have grown to love and adore dearly, but I was suspicious when I got there because he was a white man in his 70s talking about diversity and culture. He farm boy from Indiana. It doesn't get any more stereotypical evangelical than that. And that man, on the day I graduated, pulled me aside. My mother was there, my father was there, my wife was there, took us all aside. With tears in his eyes, he said, I will never, ever be able to teach the same way again because Jim Bear was in my class. And I had left my mark. Now that's one thing, but then you start moving out into this world, whether it's doing ministry, whether it's just in the workplace, and it becomes much harder to find places to leave your mark. Okay? And so one of the things I bring into the places I speak of is this, and John mentioned it today, this issue of perspective and historical perspective. Because as a native, I'm encouraged by what I see happening here. But what would really impress me is if you would know the history of what took place here. So you're all intentionally moving into communities, and that's wonderful. But community, see, we think of it's kind of a privilege of Western mindset to think of community as a here and now. We don't think of what led to this community being able to be here. So one thing I encourage people to do when they move into a neighborhood is do a historic ethnography of your neighborhood. How many times has your neighborhood changed hands throughout history? When was it an African American community? In school, had to make a timeline of your life, right? You pick the date you were born, you move it through history to the present day, and you line up things on that line accordingly. And we approach history that way as well, right? So we say 1861, Civil War is going on, goes on for 5 some years, occupies that amount of time. We can put that amount of that time on the shelf, and then we can revisit it at our leisure as it suits us. And the further we get from that point of time, the less impact it has on us. Because chronologically, along the timeline, we're 150 years removed from there. So that's sort of a white perspective of history, of time. Now what I say is if you can get any Native American to relate at all to time, it's only a very loose correspondence to actual time. We have this thing, it's just a running joke, we call it Indian time. Indian time simply means the event starts when the people get there, and it's done when people leave. We have no real preoccupation with time, okay? Because for us, we're spatially oriented. Our stories exist not in time, they exist in space, okay? And so, as I move into this space, and I mean physically, this space, Minneapolis, North Side, it's incumbent upon me to know that this land was occupied by the Dakota people, whose creation story, their Garden of Eden, is, you could ride your bike to it from here. It's right down by Fort Snelling. Literally, their Garden of Eden, the first Dakota people to ever walk the earth, right there. And it's pressed upon me to know the battles, the victories, the triumphs, the stories of suffering. It's impressed upon me to know that one of history's first concentration camps existed right below Fort Snelling. 151 years ago, 1,700 Dakota women, children, and elderly people were rounded up, marched across the entire state of Minnesota, and kept for the winter there. And those stories still linger in these places. And so when I go down below Fort Snelling, I always bring some tobacco to offer for prayers for those long dead ancestors. And one of the things I do is I lead groups into these places. And I release people to go and listen to the stories there. And it's amazing when your mindset turns just a little bit, right? It's like fine-tuning a radio station. when you turn it just a little bit, the stories come to you. I have people, one of my greatest memories of bringing people down here was a young evangelical pastor's kid who, after spending time alone in the space that I had led him to, he comes up to me with tears in his eyes and he says, "I do not have visions." And he repeated it. I mean it. I don't have visions. But let me tell you what I saw down here. And he began to tell me what he saw. Things that beforehand I would have never known. Right? This area is a state park. People jog by it, ride their bikes by it, people fishing down there with no knowledge. But when your perspective turns just a little bit, here's this kid who says, "I don't have visions, but this is what I saw." And you talk about one of those moments where theologically you just pull the pin on a hand grenade and let it go. It boom. Right? This kid walks away mumbling, "I don't have visions." He can't account for this. Because, like the 16-year-old self that I was, this doesn't coalesce with this, and we don't understand. Because this was always demonic and evil, and this was always the narrow path, right? Narrow is the path that leads to salvation.